morning, everyone, and welcome to the CBI at 10. It feels as though spring is springing. We have a different set of circumstances we face, John, don't we? Not to mention a slightly different weather forecast. So this is a chance just to take stock on that. We're going to allow ourselves a few minutes to discuss the sunshine. And John Foster, I'm going to ask you just sort of to give us a sense of things from the CBI perspective. But this morning's conversation is really to try and catch up on a subject that we might otherwise have spent the first 3 months of the year talking about, which is the implementation of the new trading relationships as a result of Brexit, understanding the trade and cooperation agreement, and in particular this morning, trying to understand what the new landscape looks like for services. So I'm delighted that Amanda Tickle, who's a partner at Deloitte, is here to help us, and I know is deep in the weeds, Amanda, of this subject. And Peter Hoggs, the head of UK Cities at Arcadis, is going to help us to understand the implications for companies big and small. But John, why don't you kick us off just with you, if you like, the sort of CBI to-do list and what you're hearing.
Brilliant, thanks James. Morning everyone, morning colleagues. Happy Monday, or as the press have dubbed it, happy Freedom Monday. Although it's a bit of a sign of the times that freedom now constitutes meeting one other household or 5 other people in a park, but alas, we are where we are. We should embrace it. James, a couple of really good announcements over the weekend that I just wanted to touch on before we get into the sort of meat of today's discussion. So firstly, on vaccines. Now, we heard on Saturday, I believe, from the Vaccines Minister, Nadhim Zahawi, about the government's intention to issue a booster jab in September to the top 4 priority groups identified by the JCVI. Now, those groups being the over 70s, the clinically vulnerable, care home workers, and NHS staff. So really good news there that is the intention. Interesting side note to the minister's announcement was that they expect that by the autumn, there could be as many as 8 different vaccinations available. So good progress on vaccines. I'm sure we all welcome that. Second thing just to touch on very briefly, James, is around testing and indeed workplace testing. 2 aspects to this. Now, we know obviously this has been a hugely popular issue for businesses. We've seen over 60,000 firms across the country already register for regular and rapid tests for employees. But as well as the existing workplace testing scheme, the government announced over the weekend that they are now making rapid home testing available for all businesses with over 10 employees for firms who cannot offer on-site testing. Now, this is a big move, something the CBI have been talking to the government about for a number of weeks, something I know has come up in the chat a fair bit as well. A little bit on the detail for you. Now, businesses across the country will be eligible to order the home test kits online to then distribute to their staff. Now, these self-test kits will be picked up by staff from their employees with clear instructions about how to take the test. The staff will then take the test at home in exactly the normal way as you'd expect them to, before reporting the result to the NHS using the gov.uk email address that will be provided. Second really important element to the testing announcement, James, is that we've seen a change in the deadline for firms wishing to express an interest in receiving government support for that rapid regular testing. Now, the deadline was due to expire at the end of this month, so just in a couple of days on the 31st of March, but the government have now announced they're going to push that deadline back to the 12th of April. So good news for any of you listening who think, yeah, actually, this kind of workplace testing done at home could be a real positive for us. I'm sure that Alice will just pop some of the details and the website address in the chat so that firms that are interested can take a bit of a look. But James, some good progress over the weekend on those 2 issues.
That's really helpful, John. Just on the testing, is that because you're inundated by requests from companies that want support, or you just think that with the sort of blizzard of other news, businesses have not been aware that the kind of gate's coming down on it?
Yeah, I think it's a bit of both, James. I think probably it's in part being driven by this new testing at home. So what we've been receiving and the message that we've been playing into government is that for lots of different firms, the workplace testing has just been really difficult. So either logistically to implement, firms have people or their staff that are operating on shift patterns that makes it quite difficult for them to put in place, or for firms that are operating across multiple sites, that's incredibly complex to do workplace testing. So I think it's in
Mm.
part being driven by this desire to roll out sort of the at-home variation, if you like. But also, we have picked up that there are firms out there that are still slightly confused about the workplace testing picture. So I think it's a really sensible, pragmatic move to both make it available for at-home testing, but also just to push that deadline back by a couple of weeks. And we'd certainly encourage any firms listening, get in contact, follow the address, ask questions, take a look. We think that workplace testing is going to be a really significant feature of how we reopen the economy for many months to come.
And John, one other thing, what are you hearing from businesses about this window, the March 29th to April 12th window, around clarity of what businesses can open on what terms?
Yeah, it's a great question, James. So actually, I think there are probably two elements to this. I think first and foremost, we've got that step increase from 1B to 2. So obviously 2 coming on April the 12th. We've got about 2 weeks now. Now, in the government's kind of 5-week plan, they only allocate 1 week for firms to prep, to basically get ready for that move to step 2. Now, what we've been saying is give us a bit more indication or clarity about what the data is showing, so that if you can just tell us whether or not we're on track to reopen for that step 2, even that extra week, so 2 weeks of just knowing, yep, it's looking like we're on track, would be
Right.
hugely helpful for firms thinking about their preparation. Because I
Yeah.
should say, James, most firms, if you're given an opportunity, would open overnight. But there are some businesses where it's really difficult to open in just a week. So the more time, the more clarity, the better. And I think the second element to this, James, is just the confusion that we are hearing around the working from office or working from home guidance and what that means as the economy moves through these steps. So the question that we're getting from firms is, well, if the government's advice is changing, why isn't the advice around working from home changing? Now,
Mm.
the message that we get back from government is that there is no change whatsoever in the working from home guidance, which is if you can, you should be doing so. They don't want to see that kind of rush of people back into the office. The roadmap purposely sets out a prioritization for reintroducing those kind of social freedoms outside, as it were, before looking at those freedoms inside a working environment, of which clearly going back to the office is one of those. So two elements there, James. Can we get a bit more clarity in terms of the time frame ahead of step 2? Are we on track or not? And then
Yeah.
secondly, just a bit more clarity of messaging from the government around what this all means from return to office, working from home, etc.
And John, are you getting much heat from businesses? Because if I understand it correctly, the government guidance is still that principle of work from home if you can
Mhm.
persist until the 21st of June. So are you hearing companies saying, hang on a second, we see very low incidence of infection in the workplace, particularly in offices. Is there a logic to maintaining this all the way out until late June?
I think what we're seeing, James, is a lot of questions. So first of all,
Right.
firms won't necessarily have picked up, as you have, that the kind of return to the office is one of the final stages of the roadmap. So first and foremost, people haven't necessarily picked up that as we move through the stages, it doesn't have a material impact on the return to office guidance. I think that's point number one. Point number two is that people are quite understandably asking, well, if the government message is changing around from stay at home to, be safe, well,
Yeah.
why doesn't that apply to the office? So firms are slightly confused around this. Where
Right.
I think firms are kind of accepting is that the transport system is a really big enabler behind all of this. And whilst there are clear sort of COVID secure guidance that firms will be able to put in place for a return to the office, those transport networks, the tubes, the trams, the trains, those big enablers, those
Yeah.
are the bits where firms are saying, well, hang on, if we are to get the return to office right, we really need to think about those transport enablers as well. So it feels like there are a couple of pieces of the jigsaw missing for how we then get back to the office.
Okay, John, thank you. Well, listen, if you thought the details of the lockdown easing were confusing, try the small print of the TCA. So let's get into Brexit and the Trade and Cooperation Agreement. And Amanda, if I might just play you in. Will you just take us gently through it? As in, before we get started into which parts of the service sector have or haven't been affected. I know that at Deloitte, you've done a lot of work on this, and I think actually with the CBI too, in just understanding what the terms are of the TCA for services. So should we start there?
Yeah, okay, well, let's start with the first principle, which is to remember there isn't actually a full single market in the EU for services at the moment like there is for goods, and that helps us when we're trying to work out what actually this trade and cooperation agreement does. So, but it does make it more complex actually to fathom the services rules, and it's where businesses are likely to see these non-tariff barriers to trade that we keep talking about, and restrictions on the ability to access EU markets in the future. So what I would do, obviously there is many pages and paragraphs to this trade and cooperation agreement. So how I would break it down is into 5 areas. I think it's about whether you're regulated or there's a licensing requirement for you to deliver your services. Do you have any professional qualifications that need recognising? Any immigration or entry requirements, the fact that you need to get to that other country, any physical presence to deliver the services that you're giving, or any digital restrictions. So those 5: regulation, qualifications, immigration, a physical presence, or digital. So in those 5 areas, if we look at what the trade agreement actually says, on regulatory alignment, it's been widely reported that there isn't much, if any, none in financial services like banking, for instance. That's had a lot of coverage already. So generally, don't expect a regulatory alignment. On the second area, that's about qualifications. So there was no mutual recognition of qualifications. It was something the UK government tried to negotiate for, but it wasn't agreed. So in this space, think architecture, accountancy, like ours. Now, there were some provisions which were welcome for the legal services around home title. So that's about the ability to provide advice on UK law into the EU. Although even here there are reservations by country. So in France there are specific restrictions on the form your company has to take, for instance. Now on mutual recognition, it wasn't all that bad, because going forward there is now a new structure for trade bodies to get recognition mutually, but this will be unilaterally country by country. So let's say, thinking about Deloitte, the ICAEW would have to agree with their equivalent trade body in another country that to recognise each other's qualifications. So that will be happening from now. In the third area, short-term business travel, around pages 600, 700 in the trade agreement, there are lots of provisions on services, and one of them is a list of business travel. So you can travel to the EU for business meetings when we're allowed to, when restrictions lift. And actually, the number of days you're allowed to spend in the EU is more beneficial than most trade agreements. So it's 90 days out of every 180. So 180 in total, but split into those 2 blocks. And again, here, you just need to think about what the purpose of your business meeting is. So you're allowed to go for trade fairs, for a negotiation meeting, maybe to perform, to make some sales, to purchase any after-sales services as well. So there's a whole list there. In the fourth area, about having to deliver your services on site. So think of something like technology integration. So you've actually got to go and set up a VPN or something in another country for telecoms. For this, you are actually allowed to provide services under contract for up to a year, but again, there are some small reservations. And in the last area, digital, any of you monitoring this will have seen the discussions on data adequacy. So was the UK, for GDPR purposes, going to be allowed to receive data in from the EU? And there's good news here. So there was a 6-month extension or period of time where it would be recognised. That was agreed in the TCA. And then on the 19th of February, actually, the European Commission recommended adopting that adequacy for GDPR. And this is important for the services sector. For instance, actually, if you think about something like payroll services, you're transferring that sensitive data, often cross-border, so the ability to provide all sorts of services like that. So I'll just finish on the fact that there are. Oh, sorry, I can't hear you, James.
Sorry, I was just going to say, Amanda. So, no. Just before you finish, because I want to come to Peter in a moment. But just before you finished, is it fair then to say, looking at those five, one of the reasons why so far we haven't seen the noise around the service sector that, for example, we have around the physical trade of goods between the island of Ireland and Britain, is that a number of these things have not been affected yet, partly because of the COVID lockdown, i.e. the movement of people, short-term business travel, even to a certain extent the delivery of services that you mentioned. All of this has been so constrained by the lockdown that we haven't really seen the new regime tested. Or is it that you think actually the new regime allows for enough flex that things are going to work okay for the next 6 to 12 months?
I think your former point, James, I think there is a delay here in feeling the impact of being out of the EU for services. So, you know, we just haven't been travelling around. So those questions that you might receive when you're at immigration now will be very different. The feeling will be very different compared to what it was before. So do you actually need a work permit? The other reason I'd say there's been less attention. I mean, you know, services are by their nature intangible, and actually the many member states, because the agreement went live so quickly with us all, they haven't actually transposed a lot of these provisions or switched their thinking for UK businesses yet. And many UK businesses perhaps haven't really appreciated that there may well be some restrictions on their ability to provide services. So I think it's a combination, but certainly the pandemic has delayed the impact.
Interesting. Peter, what's your read on it? Do you think the same? We just haven't quite seen the services sector come back to life yet, or do you think that there are some structural issues? You know, picking up on Amanda's sort of big five here that we need to.
No, I would tend to agree with Amanda. Yeah, I think there is a significant masking effect here. Yeah, Arcadis is a design, engineering, and program management company, as many people will know, and we service a number of our accounts across the EU from the UK. Now, at the moment, we are, because of COVID, we are doing that remotely, but we do retain a concern that there are still going to be underlying issues as the COVID restrictions release, and we find it very, very much more difficult to get people physically into countries. The nature of some of the work that we do is around, you know, supervision of work on site, signing off of design, etc., making sure that things have been constructed correctly, where you do physically have to be in the place where that is happening, and we do have a concern that's going to be challenging. We're already seeing some of that even under the current circumstance.
And Peter, sorry, forgive me for interrupting, but I was looking at the Arcadis website, and there's some, by the way, amazing projects. They're really fascinating projects. But my hunch is that none of them get done within a 6 to 12 month time frame. I mean, a lot of them look like they're quite, well, maybe not none of them, but quite a lot of them that look like they're quite big long-term projects. What's the extent to which what Amanda describes, i.e. the relatively short-term nature of these transitional agreements, inhibits the ability of the company to compete for these longer-term projects because the way in which you'll deliver them remains unclear?
Yeah, that does remain a concern, and you're quite right to say, James, that a number of the majority of the projects that we would take on would be of a longer time frame than 6 to 12 months. So that uncertainty in the sort of bidding and resourcing profiling of work remains a concern for us, and the ability for people to transit easily into and out of the EU is a challenge. And Amanda quite rightly pointed out another challenge, which is the fragmentation of requirement to have an understanding of 27 different sets of requirements to mirror what is the position across the whole EU.
And do you, I'm sure you work for big and small organizations and work with big and small organizations. What's your experience, Peter, of the extent to which smaller ones might find this harder to navigate than larger companies and enterprises?
Well, I think, you make a great point, James, because Arcadis is a large global organization. We have the wherewithal to sort of pull down legal advice, specialist advice around all of these issues. Our concern is for smaller SMEs in our sector who will find that more difficult, who may not have the time and the internal resources to do that. So there is a concern that the SME sector within our industry will be sort of disproportionately harmed by some of these measures.
Can I follow up that, Amanda, just with a question there? Ruth Evans has written in a question. I should have said at the top, of course, one of the great things about this CBI at 10 is really the exchange. So please do use me as the go-between, and I'll try and feed the questions and points in. But Ruth Evans has asked this question. I'll read it to you if I might, which is, can you please confirm if freelance workers can visit the UK or EU to provide services under contract for a company that the freelancer is working for? I understand that if the freelance is independent, workers are treated differently.
Yeah, well, so on that, as long as you are working for or considered to be working for the company entering into the contract, then it should be permitted. I think that's about contracting and how they're actually contracting for the services, and also how this provision of allowing work under contract is going to work. And the way, there is no two ways about how you have to approach this TCA, and that is, what service are you actually providing and in which country? Because of all the reservations, so there's a fundamental principle that you're permitted to do it, that it would be liberalised. However, each market has got their historical reservations, so you literally have to look down a whole list that says, okay, I'm entering Hungary. Does Hungary have a restriction for that particular service I'm providing? So I probably need a little bit more information on exactly what you're doing, but if the freelancer would probably have to have some sort of contractual relationship in that market to fall in the provisions.
And Amanda, when you say you need to look at the Hungarian reservation or restriction, where do you look?
Okay, so in the, I don't know, many of you probably never picked up a full trade agreement, but if you look at start on page 745, it is all searchable actually, so it's quite useful with technology now. For instance, if you want.
Sorry, is that a joke, Amanda, page 745, or is that actually the page?
No, that's the actual page. Yeah. So if you start, I've looked at this page a lot. So if you start on that page, that will tell you about the short-term business visitor rules. So what sort of activities would I be allowed to perform if I go there? So you start looking down that page. Oh yeah, that's what I want to do. It's for a training seminar, let's say. Then what you do is you flick through the next few pages, and there's a whole schedule there which describes a reservation that each country might have. So for instance, you might be able to go for a trade fair for up to 5 days in one country or up to 2 weeks in another. Anything after that would require a work permit, and it lays out in the trade agreement exactly what you're allowed to do, which is the positive of having a trade agreement. It means there is actually somewhere to work out what's been agreed.
Okay, well, I'm afraid you've now laid yourself open, Amanda, to a new game called small print whack-a-mole, where we're trying to identify particular issues, because someone, Wayne Andrews, who runs a business, the MD of Grace Church Treasury Risk Consultants, asked questions. I think it's on the back of your point about the fact there's not been regulatory alignment in financial services, but he asks whether an EU-based firm can bring in a UK-based consultancy firm to advise them on risk management issues.
Well, this goes back to regulation. So would it fall, that first question, is your activity regulated? So I come to my own business, it's generally an accounting business, but of course we do consulting as well. So if we were doing an audit of a business, that would be regulated. If it was consulting, it's generally not regulated. So is your risk advisory service a regulated financial service, or is it a consulting service? So that's probably the first question. And if it's regulated, you need to go back to well, the fundamental assumption that actually there is no recognition of the regulatory regime in the UK, so that you can just literally move and provide your services in that country. So that's the question you should ask.
Okay, Amanda, thank you. John, can I just come to you on sort of the broader politics and of this? In December, certainly November through to December, when there was anxiety that no agreement would be reached, one of the arguments for an agreement was, even if it wasn't going to deliver as much as business might have hoped, right, even if it was a quote unquote skin deal, it would be the starting point to a much broader set of agreements on services. But if you listen to Amanda and you sort of hear Peter's tone, you can't help feeling that so far the agreements on services are either non-existent, as in regulatory alignment, or pretty short term around, qualifications and, business travel. What do you hear from British businesses about their anxieties, and what do you think the direction of travel is likely to be in the kind of next steps on negotiation?
Yeah, no, thank you, Jane. Actually, it's interesting. Amanda and I were actually at a meeting on Thursday where a lot of the contributors sort of prefaced their contributions by saying, first and foremost, it was good that we got a deal. So I think you're right that it's quite a skinny deal, but I haven't heard anyone sort of reflect on the fact that this deal is worse than if we hadn't achieved one. So that's the kind of starting point. I think secondly, there are kind of number of known unknowns. So within the agreement, there is the ability to, if you like, build up. Now, actually, over the weekend, James, you just mentioned financial services. We had a good step forward in that both the EU and the UK have reached technical agreement for a memorandum of understanding when it comes to financial services. Now, that's not been politically signed off, but we wouldn't expect there to be any problems. What that will then do is create a forum for regulatory dialogue between the UK and the EU. So that, if you like, is the kind of first step for how do you build ongoing relations to hopefully get to a point where we can start to normalize some of the trading relationship between the UK and the EU on services. It's never going to be how it used to be. I think that's the point. What firms are now hoping for is, can we use the TCA and the provisions that are included in it to build out the infrastructure, the governance procedures to help formulate that dialogue so we can start to build up that deal. FS is a good example. Mutual recognition of professional qualifications is another. So we've been talking to the government about, can you be ambitious in trying to seek some bilateral agreements around things like business travel, professional qualifications with member states, just to provide a bit more of an overarching framework. And then finally, and again, this is something that Amanda and I and other colleagues picked up. So Amanda mentioned the complexity of 27 different member states. Actually, one of the things the government could really usefully do, and we think they're sort of looking at this, is just provide business-friendly advice on gov.uk, so that if you're a firm that operates in Romania and the Netherlands, a lot of the advice will be in Romanian or Dutch. So actually, can there be a really simple business translated page on gov.uk where you can go and have a look? So there's those two aspects, James, there's the guidance, but also there's the kind of governance procedures to try and build out the deal. That's probably what needs to happen next.
John, thank you. Peter, can I just ask you a little bit about the competitive landscape? When we first started looking at the TCA, some of the things that you heard from businesses were about competitor companies using the change in the trading terms to make changes to price or contracts, essentially exploiting the change in the relationship to try and gain market share. We can understand that that's bound to happen, but I just wonder how much you're seeing of that, how much you're seeing people trying to crowd out what you do because the trading relationship has changed, and to an extent whether or not you're seeing a change in the incoming business, the extent to which people who provide engineering and architecture services might be beginning to look at the UK differently too.
So I think it's too early to sort of draw out any major, sorry, apologies for that, any major themes around that. What we are seeing is a degree to which there is a difference in terms of how some clients are looking at their opportunities to work with a UK-based organisation. So they're asking a lot of searching questions about abilities to resource, for example. How will you service work? How will you get things done and achieved. So we're seeing quite a lot of challenges around that in terms of outbound activity. We're also seeing quite a lot of focus in terms of inbound activity, in terms of what proof you can provide that you're going to be able to provide the materials, the certifications, the regulatory and governance evidence, for example, of compliance. So we're certainly seeing more questioning, more challenging undertaken. I don't think yet we're seeing that sort of pull through any material difference in volumes of work, or indeed even success rates in what we bid for, either here in the UK or perhaps more importantly within the EU.
And is there, Peter, just out of interest, maybe I'm being sort of too skeptical in the kind of tone of questioning, are there also opportunities, you think? You think, hang on a second, there are things that have opened up, or the way we see the market differently as a result of this? Or again, is it just, end of March and too soon?
I think it's very difficult to see any upside, James. I think what we can do is think about some very positive mitigations that we can take to sort of minimize risk. I think also what we can see is the opportunity, for example, to use some of those mitigations to generally improve business performance. So one of the ones, for example, that we look at in our sector is, can we improve productivity through greater automation, sort of making access to workforce, labour and skills might we can certainly look at, and that's something where investment could definitely provide a benefit. But again, I come back to one of the points I made earlier about a concern for the sector as a whole, that's rather easier for bigger organisations to do rather than SMEs. And again, I'm concerned that some of the opportunities that larger organisations like Arcadis will be able to make may not be open to smaller organisations, which may leave them disadvantaged.
Peter, thank you. Amanda, can I go back to the point you made, which I suppose lots of people are just beginning to wrap their heads around, which is business travel. So I imagine companies are beginning to think, oh, right, we're going to get on the road in the next few weeks. Some, I guess, already are, but mostly not. What are the preparations you need to make now when you're going on a business trip into the EU that you didn't need to make before?
I think so. The first thing to think about is, what's the purpose of the trip? Why are you moving someone? Are you just going for a normal business meeting where you're going to go to one of your other offices, meet with colleagues and come back a couple of days later? Now, generally, all of those sorts of activities are permitted. They're all laid out, as I said, in this list. Literally go to page 745 and you'll see what it looks like. If you are intending to be in that country for a longer period of time and you're actually delivering your services in that market while you're there, that is a completely different question, and you'll need to consider in more depth whether you need any sort of work permit from that particular market. And again, that is all in this section of the TCO. And I'd just like to pick up on something that Peter said. I know, the government is trying to make this information available. It does take time to actually analyse all of this into language, which is searchable on gov.uk and actually easy to understand, rather than trying to go to that individual country's website, which is often not in English or not necessarily up to date. So I think hopefully in the next few weeks we should be able to see more information being made available for business to work out whether or not they can go there for a business meeting.
And Amanda, can I ask you this from the small ball to the big picture? Ranil Pereira, actually, it's not so much of a question, it's more of an observation, which is that he writes, for years, Frankfurt, Luxembourg and Paris have sought to prize from London its position as the world's leading financial services centre, and then goes on to ask the extent to which these regulatory changes are likely to impact that. What's your judgment at this stage on what the likely impact is on London's position as a global financial centre, and whether that is going to shift, some of that business is fundamentally going to shift to the European Union?
Look, I'm not a financial services expert. I'm looking at the sort of overview, but what I would say is mainly from the reports we've seen, there hasn't been a huge exodus from the UK market yet. It's just what happens over the long term, and it's very difficult to predict. I mean, you know, if the UK does manage to diverge successfully from a regulatory perspective and perhaps align with more global banking regulations rather than those in the EU, then it could survive and thrive. And I think it's really just too early to tell. And for now, we've seen dual structures implemented so that the financial services sector can continue to access both the EU and the UK market. So they've restructured and put some resources in, but we haven't seen the huge drain out of London that many did predict, or well, the UK, sorry, not just London, yet.
I think one of the questions has been about, and implied in Ronald's question too, is this whether or not you see the chipping away of certain parts of the kind of the ecosystem, the range of different services. So you've seen movement around, for example, clearing, and I wonder whether or not there is a sort of system behind the EU's thinking around taking particular parts of the financial services sector, perhaps ones that are not front and center, but are slowly changing the dynamic between London and the European Union. Is that a fair description of what you see happening from Brussels?
It could do. As I said, it's hard to predict, because the one thing that we do know that's happened is it hasn't all gone to one particular market, so it's actually more fragmented. And I think there's a big strength in providing services and having a real core, if you like, and scale in one country. So we haven't really seen one country benefit, which may mean that there is sort of less movement going forward. Who knows? But I think the other thing to be aware of is, you know, the future of this sector. You know, it's about fintech, it's about modernising. So what actually is going to happen in this whole sector, full stop? How is it going to be regulated and encouraged to grow? And whether or not the UK can take a leading world position in all those new services, rather than thinking of the changes to all the past ones, which I think have largely been done by the sector.
And Amanda, one final thought for you, which is, obviously people have been quite disturbed by what's been happening between the UK and the EU around vaccines, and I'm just intrigued to know whether or not you think that the way in which service agreements and the small print on these deals is done is so far removed from the front page politics of it that, you know, if there are tense telephone calls between Boris Johnson and Ursula von der Leyen, that's not really going to make an impact to the progress that's happening, or whether or not these things do in one form or other seep through.
Look, I think we've got a fundamental starting point now in the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, and I just go back to what John and Peter said, you know, that it was a real relief for business generally that we had a deal. We have got a relationship to start from in services, and from which to, you know, we've got these committees and there are structures for working out disputes, and I think that is a really good position to be in compared to where we could have been if we hadn't got this trade deal. So I think we've always got to come down to that, and there are always going to be political commentary overlaying this. But you know, there are opportunities as well. I know, Peter, you know, although you're saying it's about restructure, you know, for many businesses, they're quite excited about serving a more complex market. So if you're in the logistics field and you're providing services on sort of analytics and how to clear the goods, freight forwarding, immigration services, these sorts of businesses are thinking that actually it is a more complex environment and there's demand for my services. So I think for those, they're viewing it as actually with opportunity. So we have to look at both sides of it. And we don't know where the UK is going to end up. We could end up with better access to services businesses from all these other free trade agreements they want to do with the rest of the world. You know, we could end up being a hub for services trade. So I think it's just going to be a very long period of time that we've got to look forward.
Amanda, thank you. Peter, can I just ask you on that front, do you feel that the orientation of the business begins to change, that Arcadis itself begins to think, I mean, it's already an international business, so whether or not its priorities move elsewhere, is that beginning to happen within the thinking of the company?
Well, I think, James, as you say, Arcadis has always been a global business. I think for us, we're a Dutch company, we're Dutch headquartered. The EU will always be an important market for us. The UK will always be an important market for us. Yeah, very much as Amanda was saying, we will look for ways to make that work, and we will look to take every opportunity that we can within that. So I don't see us turning away from sort of Anglo-EU trade. I think there's too much at stake to do that. What we will be looking to do is to find all the ways to make that as easy as and as straightforward as possible. But no, I don't see us fundamentally changing the relationship between the work we do and the capability we have in the UK and our markets in the EU.
And practically speaking, we always talk about this, or often talk about this, with a sort of UK to the EU lens on. Your continental colleagues, Peter, are they voicing any concern about the ease with which they can come and do business here in the UK?
Somewhat, but they're voicing very similar concerns to the ones that we're voicing. So as Amanda said, it's around the uncertainty, it's around the appetite to know how things are going to pan out. As I said, we're a Dutch headquartered business, so a lot of that sort of inbound activity from other parts of Arcadis to the UK comes from the Netherlands, as the Netherlands has a significant volume of trade with the UK, and has been one of the ones one of the EU nations that's made most detailed preparations for how to work with the UK. So I think we're seeing a recognition that things are more uncertain, that things may be more difficult in certain areas. But much as Amanda was describing the things that UK businesses can and should do in order to prepare themselves to move out into the 27 nations of the EU, we're also seeing certain EU nations and colleagues in those nations benefiting from similar preparations in order to be able to continue to do business in the UK, and that's been particularly strong in our experience with the link between the Netherlands and the UK.
Interesting. Okay, Peter, thank you. Well, listen, Amanda Tickle from Deloitte, thank you very much, and Peter Hunt from Arcadis, thank you too. Just in the last minute before we wrap up, John, I just wanted to go back to you, because after you made these points about testing and the extension of the government deadline for business applications for support on testing to April the 12th, I think you said, we had a number of people in the chat who said actually they're hearing that the testing is quite cumbersome, i.e. it's quite bureaucratic. Some people find lateral flow tests difficult to administer, and I just wonder whether you're hearing something similar, and what your advice is to businesses who are finding that hard going.
Yep, brilliant question to finish on, James. So yes, we are hearing something similar. We are hearing that there are both logistical, operational, and just clarity issues with the workplace testing. So we're getting lots of that. We're in regular dialogue with the Department for Health. So if you've got very specific examples, feed them in via the chat. They're super helpful for us. We will keep taking those concerns to the government. And then I just finished with 20 seconds, James, on a plug. So we're going to be running a webinar on April the 12th around testing. Hopefully we'll have some brilliant experts, and all the colleagues that are listening in can dial in and put their questions to them. So just to finish on that quick plug.
Okay, John, thank you. Well, I'm going to give a plug too, because on Wednesday, the CBI at 10 is beginning to think about, or not beginning to think about, is thinking in detail about reopening. So we've got Kate Nichols from UK Hospitality, who you may have heard of before, is very good on the detail of pubs and restaurants, and Helen Dickinson from the British Retail Consortium will be talking about shops and the business of getting reopened by April the 12th. So please do join us at 10 o'clock. But for this morning, a big thank you to Peter, to Amanda, and to you too, John. Have a very good week, everyone. Take care of yourselves and enjoy the weather.
Thank you.